Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another video from Homesteading Off the Grid and another morning ramble. Guys, we have another story for you today about an annoying neighbor. And this story involves the ultimate revenge one could get on an annoying neighbor. But this revenge was brought about in a very unique, very mysterious way. You know, a lot of you folks have been here with us on the channel for quite a while. A lot of you have told many of your own stories. We've addressed some stories here with some of the videos we've done. Very touching stories. I thank each and every one of you who has shared a story. I had a lady share a story with us yesterday in a comment in the comment section on the video about the annoying neighbor in the crayon. That's probably the video that brought most of you here to the channel. She had a similar experience with an annoying neighbor, and I asked her for permission to tell her story, and she said that she would love it if I told this story, so I'm going to tell her story. She goes by the name Theris Grace on YouTube, and I'm not sure if that is maybe her moniker, maybe it's a hyphenation of There Is Grace, and she just put There Is together and Theris Grace. It's a beautiful name if it is her real name. I don't want to assume either way, because I've learned in the trips I've taken around this world for a number of years, assume nothing, question everything. So, but she goes by the moniker There Is Grace, 2 words. And she shared a very touching story that involved her husband, who's passed away. I'm going to call her Mrs. G, and I'm going to refer to her husband as Mr. G, because she used the word or the name Grace. We're just going to go with that. Mrs. G shared a very touching story about her and her husband, Mr. G, and Mr. G's blue tick hound named Rex. And I guess the part of my story about my annoying neighbor I had out here, Mr. J, is what we've called him, and I use that because his first or last name, neither one starts with a J. And ironically, the best neighbor I've ever had in my life, who is the only guy within sight of us, lives next door. His name does start with a J, and so we talked a couple of weeks ago. He said that he saw the video on YouTube because YouTube recommended it to him, and at first when he heard Mr. J, he thought he was the annoying neighbor, until of course he listened to the story and he knew exactly who I was talking about. So we had a good laugh. So there's another example as to why we should assume nothing but question everything. I wasn't referring to him in the least bit. I actually would like to get him on the show at some point. Hint, hint. This guy, he can fix anything. He can make anything. He builds airplanes. Well, here I go, digressing again, right? Yeah, he builds airplanes over here in the woods. Sometimes you'll hear a loud bang while I'm having these morning rambles. That's him building an airplane in the woods, in the middle of just the woods. Okay, so anyway, in my story about the annoying neighbor with the crayon, you'll remember that me and Dearly, my wife, and our son Daniel, were out for a joyride, and we found a lost, abandoned blue tick puppy, 3 months old, starving to death. You could see its ribs, fleas all over it, ticks. We brought it home, we rescued it, nurtured it back to health, and then eventually found it a good home with good people. Well, Mr. G had a blue tick hound named Rex that he loved very much. And Mrs. G, Mr. G, and their 2 daughters had to take a trip to New York for the funeral of Mr. G's mother. So they were gone for a few days. And when they came back, they noticed something very strange in part of their yard. They had a bunch of rocks, just rocks everywhere in a certain part of their yard. They didn't really know what to make of it until the next day, or sometime shortly after their arrival home. Their neighbor, their immediate neighbor, which was the only one they only had one neighbor close by also, came over and just read Mr. G the riot act about how his dog was just howling and howling and howling the whole time that the family, the G family, had been out of town. And so Mr. G talked to the neighbor, the very annoying neighbor, obviously, and in this guy's defense, of course, if the howling dogs can be annoying too, so we're not, you know, It's going to sound like a pun, but I'm going to say we're not casting stones in all directions here. Maybe we are, maybe we aren't. So Mr. G talks to the neighbor away from Mrs. G. He comes back, and Mrs. G is like, what's up? And Mr. G says, don't worry about it. Leave it alone. You know, he mentions what had gone on about the dog howling. And Mrs. G knew that Mr. G had not married a fool. And she knew at that time exactly where those rocks came from. And she told Mr. G that. She said, well, now we know where those rocks came from. And Mr. G said, well, no, we don't know that. We can't prove that. You know, we can't, you know, assume everything, or assume nothing, question everything, right? Well, Mrs. G felt fairly confident that that's where those rocks came from. You see where I'm going with this. The neighbor's over there just tossing rocks at the dog as the dog's howling while the G's are out of town. So anyway, time goes by, and unfortunately, Mr. G passed away about a year after this. It's a sad part of this story. Well, not long after Mr. G had passed away, this annoying neighbor, who Mrs. G believed had thrown the rocks, came over, and he hadn't spoken to Mrs. G since that event. She really felt that she wanted an apology, and she made this obvious to Mr. G while he was still alive, that she was owed an apology for this guy throwing rocks at Mr. G's dog. And Mrs. G said in her comment about how much this dog Rex meant to her husband. They had 2 daughters, so the dog was a male. So Mr. G, the only other male he had in the house with his wife and his 2 daughters, was this dog, and it was his best buddy. And they used to go hunting together. They'd go out hiking together. And Mrs. G could always tell that her husband was just in better spirits, a much better mood whenever he spent time with his dog. She even mentioned that sometimes she'd put a sweater on the dog, and when Mr. G would come home and see his dog, his best friend Rex, in a sweater, he'd just light up and get all giddy. So Mrs. G felt as if she were owed an apology because it was such an offense that an animal that meant so much to somebody that meant so much to her had been treated like this, and these rocks had been thrown. But the neighbor never apologized until several days after, or a short time after the passing of Mr. G. The neighbor comes over, knocks on the door. Mrs. G opens the door, and she's wondering, okay, what's going on here? This is the annoying neighbor that she believed was throwing the rocks into the yard. So the neighbor, he fessed up to it. He admitted that it had been him who had thrown the rocks, and he apologized. And Mrs. G was kind of shocked, and you can probably relate to her, right? Why now? Why after all this time? Was it that he felt compassion toward her finally because he knew she had just lost her husband? Nope, none of the above. Here's where it gets kind of creepy, guys. Well, creepy or touching, okay? Let me put it that way. I actually was originally going to, it's still very, very early. The sun is still coming up. It's not even up yet. You can see it over there. See that? It's going to be another 15 minutes or so. It's the end of August, and it's not even 7 a.m. yet. I originally thought about coming up here last night and building a little campfire because I'm up here at the family campground on our homestead. And I thought about telling this story after dark. But then I thought, you know, that would be very disrespectful to Mrs. G. And so I didn't do it that way. I waited till early this morning to come up here and tell it the right way. Because though you're going to see what I'm getting at here in a minute as far as the forces involved with this story. They can be spun in different ways. But this, to me, is as much a love story, a story which shows the power of love, even from beyond the grave, as it is anything else. Even particularly dealing with an annoying neighbor and getting the best revenge ever with an annoying neighbor. So the annoying neighbor who'd thrown the rocks comes over, knocks on the door. Mrs. G's trying to figure out why, and he apologizes. He says, I'm the one that threw the rocks, and I am sorry that I did this, and I just wanted to finally come over here and let you know I'm very sorry. Please forgive me. And so again, she's thinking, why now? What's going on here? And the neighbor then says, I feel that I must apologize because it's got to stop. It has to stop. And I believe this is the only way to get it to stop. Well, this kind of threw Mrs. G. And she was like, what do you mean? What has to stop? What's going on here? So the annoying neighbor who had thrown rocks we now know because he finally fessed up to it, let her know, told Mrs. G that after he had thrown the rocks, this is about a year before, if he would ever throw a rock again, the next morning, a rock, the rock he threw would be ever so carefully placed very lightly on the hood of his car. Well, the annoying neighbor knew, or assumed, again, let's assume nothing, question everything. The annoying neighbor assumed it was the husband putting a rock there. And so I guess they had this silent feud going on back and forth for a time. The annoying neighbor would throw the rock at the howling dog. The husband wouldn't say a word. And I guess the Mrs. G pointed out in her comments my story about the annoying neighbor and how I dealt with an annoying neighbor in a very non-confrontational way, in a way that didn't involve violence, in a way that didn't involve getting the police involved, because those guys and girls are burdened with enough real crime to be asked to step in with the feuding neighbor spat, because you got a couple folks that just can't grow up, or at least one that's driving the other one to the point of insanity, to where they kind of revert back into juvenilism. So she related to that. She related to the blue tick hound in my story, but her husband found a way to kind of get his point across to this annoying neighbor they had without becoming violent, without calling the police. And that way was to just, if that neighbor threw a rock at night into their yard, he would take the rock and he'd place it on the hood of the car, as if to say, here, this belongs to you, not us. You can have it back. And then also showing the restraint of not just going off at the mouth saying, oh yeah, you're going to do that, I'm going to do this, like Jerry Springer show. A way to respond without words, without action, like my sign in the crayon. So anyway, the annoying neighbor says, I've got to apologize because it's got to stop. And Mrs. G is like, I don't understand what you're talking about. My husband passed away recently. And the guy says, yeah, I know. And he said, the rocks are still there. He says, every morning I go out and there on the hood of my car is a rock that I'd thrown at some point into your yard. And the guy went on to explain about how he just felt in his heart and his soul that that the husband wanted this guy to apologize to Mrs. G, the wife, because she had never gotten her apology. And the husband knew how much it had bothered his wife. And so the husband wanted to make sure that his beautiful bride got her apology. And the point was made very clear to the annoying neighbor who had been throwing the rocks. So he apologized to Mrs. G, and the rock stopped. After this neighbor came over and made his official apology, he never found another rock on the hood of his car ever again. So that's one of those stories that we come across from time to time from you folks who watch the channel and who subscribe, and for whom we're very thankful. And I wanted to share that story with you. Now, you might be saying, oh, this kind of thing doesn't happen, or you made that up. Guys, me and Mrs. G had a little conversation in the comment section of the original video of the annoying neighbor in the crayon. You can go back and read it for yourself. I'm not making this up. And what I'm going to say in regard to her telling the story, I've said it 3 or 4 times already, and I'll say it again. Assume nothing, question everything. I'm not going to assume she made it up, and I'm not going to assume she didn't. As you can imagine, it brings about many questions. Does this type of thing happen? Can love, and again, to me, this is why I came up here and told her this morning over beautiful sunrise, which is starting to come up now, instead of last night over a campfire. This isn't an eerie, creepy, scary, terrifying ghost tale to me. This is a beautiful, supernatural story of love, about a love that can transcend beyond the grave. So I want to hear your thoughts on this story. Give them to us in the comments section. As always, thank you for being here with us at Homesteading Off the Grid. And since it is almost 7, I got to get down there to my family, to my beautiful bride and our beautiful darling son, and spend some time with them, snuggle with them, and get our day started. Hope you guys have a wonderful day. We'll see you with more next time, and I'm going to give you a beautiful shot to part with you here of this beautiful sunrise here over the homestead. You guys have a blessed day.